Hello dear students and welcome back to this discussion on modern Indian history. While you were studying modern history during your school days, I'm sure some very fundamental questions would have crossed your minds. Why did Europeans come to India from over 20,000 nautical miles away? What kind of policies and strategies did they use to suppress a civilization that had a history stretching back millennia? Why were they so massively successful in establishing their rule over here? And how did, a handful of them control over such a massive subcontinent? All that and a lot more is going to be answered in this series, that is Modern Indian History, where I, Jawwad Kazi, will be taking up topics from our history textbook, Modern Indian History by StudyIQ IAS. Let's get started, guys, and try to understand the context of advent of Europeans to India. Guys, India as a civilization was very well known to the ancient and medieval worlds. India was, very well connected through old trade routes with different parts of the then world, the old world as we call it. There was an overland trade route that connected India to Europe via Central Asia. This was the famous Silk Route. You can see that on the map over here. From Central Asia, this trade route, passed, and India was connected to this trade route also. And Indian products made their way to markets of East Europe and then onwards to other places. So this was one route. Then second was the Persian Gulf route. Again, as you can see here in the map, the Persian Gulf route also enabled Indians to connect with the rest of the world as the trading goods passed via the Persian Gulf, then onto the Mediterranean coast, and then from here the Italian merchants would pick it up and take it to markets of Europe. Similarly, the route via the Red Sea was also very famous, and this also got the Indian goods right up to the coast of Mediterranean Sea, from where they could be passed on to Europe. So using these routes, Indian goods were reaching the markets of Europe, and there was immense demand for India's fine products. And what were these? Silk. Silk was very popular. The elites of these regions wore that cloth, and that distinguished or marked out their class character. Indian muslin, malmal. Okay, that's a cloth that appears like silk, very light cloth. The Europeans used to say that this is air that is woven. It's not a cloth, it is air that is woven. That is how light it was, muslin. Cotton, which of course India was and continues to be famous for. Then indigo, the natural dye, which was used by Europeans to color their clothes. Back then in Europe, since the cultivation of natural dyes was not possible, this product of indigo was in immense demand because that enabled people to wear colored clothes. Only the rich and elite of the society could afford to wear these colored clothes because those clothes were dyed by using indigo coming from as far as India for them. Then later saltpeter. Saltpeter was used in gunpowder, as we have seen in some of our earlier sessions also. And this was very crucial for using your matchlock guns, your muskets, as well as your big cannon guns. This saltpeter was very crucial for the big kings of Europe who used these massive guns to fight against their feudal lords and amongst themselves also. Then Indian ivory, elephant tusks, with very fine carvings, very intricate designs. They were sold in markets of Europe as luxury items. Spices, the most famous, of course. Indian spices were in huge demand, especially black pepper. Europe, which has a very cold climate, had the problem of preserving meat during cold, especially winter times. Black pepper not only was useful for adding some taste to the otherwise unpalatable meat, but it also enabled to preserve the meat for a longer duration. And that's why it is very much connected with their, existence as such. Consequently, there was tremendous demand for Indian goods in European markets. A Roman historian, Pliny, around 70 AD, had written that India is the sink of the world's gold. Sink of the world's gold. Back then, there were no dollars, right? The only payment system acceptable was bullion, that is precious, precious material like gold and silver. So when the world wanted to buy Indian products, they had to pay up in gold. And that's why Pliny says that India is a sink of gold. Okay. So back then also we were a gold obsessed country, guys. Even today, after petroleum, the second ranked item in our imports by value is gold. We are a gold crazy country. We continue to be that sink, but now in a different sense, of course. Okay. India enjoyed a share of 24% in world GDP, even at the death of Aurangzeb. Even when we are on the threshold of entering the later Mughal phase, which we have discussed at very great length. In case you have not seen the earlier videos, the link is available in the description box. I'll urge you to watch all the videos, guys. So even when we enter the political chaos period, economically speaking, India was doing very handsomely with a quarter of the world's share of GDP. Now, if you see it today, according to a website, Statista, it is about 7.25% and expected to rise slightly over the next few years. Now, so you can see the drop in the share vis-a-vis those times. Arabs and Italians were the crucial merchants who used to carry Indian goods across the sea. Why do we call the sea on our west coast as Arabian Sea? Because it was the Arabs who had actually first understood the mechanism of monsoon. Okay, the seasonal flow of winds from southwest towards northeast direction, and then their reversal were understood by the Arabs first, and they used it for trading related purpose, and consequently the sea became virtually a lake of Arab merchants, and hence the name. So they carried Indian goods right up to the Mediterranean coast over here, and from this point onwards the Italians used to pick it up. Famous cities like Aleppo. Okay, from here the Italian merchants used to pick it up, Venetians, people from Genoa, Genoese merchants, and then they used to take it to other parts of Europe. Okay, so these two you can say groups of merchants played a very crucial role in developing India's trade. But all of this starts to change with a landmark development in the history of the world. According to one historian who has ranked the most important events of world history, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 is the seventh most important or seminal event in the history of the world. We'll have to understand this particular event, guys. Constantinople over here was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire. And this city, today's Istanbul, is very, very strategically located because it is the guarding gate of the Black Sea. Whoever has control over Constantinople has control over Black Sea's access also. And furthermore, it is also overlooking the trade, the route that we earlier saw, that trade also overland trade route from Asia, China and India in particular, that used to pass through this area, and consequently control of Constantinople meant access to that trade route also. Okay. Furthermore, through Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, a person coming from Black Sea gets access to Aegean Sea, and then further down south to the Mediterranean Sea also. So in that sense, on the land, this particular city was extremely crucial, and therefore it was founded as the capital of Eastern Roman Empire. I mean, it was founded earlier, and then later it becomes the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the city of Constantinople. Now, this city in 1453 fell to the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Turks, who are rising over here around 1326, Osman of this dynasty, Ottomans, he founds this rule, and from his name, it's an anglicized version of Osman, Ottoman. So Ottoman Turks are basically a dynasty starting way back in 1326. So they have established their rule over here, and their rule is expanding towards Europe. Getting this idea? And Constantinople is that prize that every Ottoman Sultan dreamed of getting someday. 20 armies, as many as 20 invasions were planned on this city, but none could succeed until in 1453, a young Sultan, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, he took this city. For 4 long months, with more than 70 guns, big guns, he bombarded the city of Constantinople. The biggest gun that he had, the biggest tope that he had, the Shahi tope, it used to fire a cannon ball of more than 500 kg, over a distance of approx about 2 odd kilometers. So you can imagine the kind of momentum a cannonball having weight of about 500 kg being, having that parabola coming from 2 kilometers or so will be, having an impact on the walls of the city. So after 4 months of siege, finally the city fell and the Ottomans came in control of this trade route. Now this led to a lot of disruption for rest of Europe. Ottomans and many Eastern European kingdoms, they had a long drawn conflict. Furthermore, this also comes in the backdrop of the Crusades, where the Christian Europe and the Muslim East, they had been fighting now for quite some time. In that context, this overland trade route became unsafe and expensive for Europeans. So this huge demand for Indian products could not be sufficiently met because one very crucial sea route, overland route, had become unviable for Europeans. Now the problem with this was the other two routes were dominated by Italian merchants, and they knew that this route is now difficult and therefore the scarcity was there, prices were becoming high, and other European nations started to feel the pinch because of this. Consequently, to outdo the Arabs and Italians who were dominating the other sea routes, there was a need felt to find some alternate safe sea routes to Asia in general and India in particular. This was the motivating factor to start with. Europeans wanted to continue to have access to that trade. The lead in this pursuit of finding safe sea route to India was taken first by Portugal and Spain. The Portuguese and the Spanish people were the first to take lead in this regard, and they set out sail into the Atlantic Ocean to find this safe sea route to Asia in general and India in particular. This, by the way, guys, comes in the backdrop of Age of Renaissance. Okay, I have in detail discussed the topic of Renaissance in my world history series. Somewhere on the screen, you'll get the I button to that also. Do watch that video and other videos of that series as well. Now, Renaissance started an age of, reducing control of the church. The Christian church back then, during the medieval times, was superstitious. It did not allow reason. It did not allow scientific advancement. But because of Renaissance, Europeans started to have a relook at their glorious past during ancient Roman and Greek times. And they started to shift away their focus from the other world and, religion, etc., to this worldly life and making the most of what the material benefits this world can offer. This changed attitude led to many scientific developments in this process. I have discussed at great length the scientific revolution of this period also, guys, in that particular series. These scientific developments and the age of reason that were inaugurated on account of Renaissance changed the attitude of Europeans from being superstitious, from being dogmatic, from being otherworldly, to being bold, daring, adventurous, and taking on risks to set out into the Atlantic Ocean to find a safe route to India. Many advancements were made for this purpose in the art or craft of building more robust ships. Now, earlier the European voyages in the sea were limited in terms of distance, but now they were going to set sail in sea. Science had shown that the world is not flat like what Christianity or what Bible hints at. Instead, the world is like a round ball. So Europeans felt if the world is like a round ball, then if we circumnavigate around the world, then at some point we are going to reach Asia. With this hope, they set out sails into the Atlantic Ocean, knowing very little that on the other side of the Atlantic were in fact two massive continents of North and South America. This entire period led to several new discoveries in what is referred to as the New World. The New World includes the continents of North and South America, guys. Europeans finally realized that it is not possible to circumnavigate the globe easily, and instead we need to have some other route towards Asia. And in this regard, we will see the Portuguese will make the first breakthrough. Now let us see, guys, who all European merchants, traders came to India, and then we will dive deeper into history of the Portuguese, who will be the first to come. So the European traders who came to India included the Portuguese, the Dutch, the English, French, and also Danes. The last nationality, the Danes, did not play a very significant role as such, but others are definitely quite relevant for our history. The Portuguese are the ones who are the pioneers in this regard. They are the ones who start out this process, and therefore we are going to start our discussion with the Portuguese first. All right, so let's get started with our discussion now on Portuguese. Okay, before I do that, very quickly, let me give you a very crucial announcement. Our batch for September has already begun yesterday. It is a one-stop solution, guys, as I keep on telling you, for all your civil services preparation needs. In case you are still in dual minds, I'll strongly recommend that you take a final decision and enroll for this batch so that your civil services preparation can give in the desired direction, orientation, and shape. With very experienced faculty, I'm also part of that team of very experienced and dedicated faculties with copious study material, with books like the one we are using for this discussion. This particular batch is going to build a robust foundation of your base for civil services examination. In the first leg of this batch, we are going to deal with the foundational aspects of civil services examination. Subsequently, seeing the changing nature of prelims, we have designed a special program from January onwards for prelims sake. There in that program, we are going to focus more on building up the conceptual clarity, building up the factual information base, and most significantly, building the right sort of approach to tackling MCQs. This batch includes not only daily and weekly tests, but it also includes full prelims test series as well. By the time you actually appear for the prelims exam, you would have solved several thousand prelims MCQs along with your batch itself, apart from whatever extra you will practice, of course. Apart from prelims, we also have a mains residential program for which you don't have to pay a single dime extra. Those students who will clear the prelims examination from these batches, they will be called in Delhi for a mains residential program where you will be trained, prepared for the mains along with peers in presence of faculty as well as, experienced mentors. Now, these mentors, guys, let me tell you, while the faculty are very well known to you on the channel, the mentors also are ones who have had substantial experience of this exam and have appeared for interview stage during their own preparation journey. So this is a golden opportunity for you guys to make the most of. I'll strongly recommend that you enroll for this batch, and for that you can use my code JDLive to get a substantial discount on the fees of this course. Also, to download the PDFs of this class, you can use this QR code to reach my channel Jawwad Kazi UPSC Preparation and download the content and get my video links from there. Okay. All right. Now let us get started with the discussion on Portuguese. Let us first try to have a timeline regarding the arrival of Portuguese in India. The trigger point, as I told you, was in 1453 when Constantinople fell to the Muslim power Ottoman Turks. Now this obviously made the Christian Europe led by the Pope a little worried about the future of the Christian West. Already, as I told you, in the larger context, larger backdrop or context, in preceding centuries, there had been the crusades between the Muslim and Christian world. In consequence to that, Pope Nicholas V, remember the name, Pope Nicholas V, had issued a bull. Okay, had issued a bull to Portugal. Bull, what is meant by bull over here? Means a right. For Portugal, giving it a right to navigate to the Orient to fight Islamic influence and spread Christianity. Okay. Now, since traditionally speaking, religion or Christianity in this context had given certain superstitions that made it difficult for people to take on these ventures or journeys. But now the context had changed, science had advanced, and also there was a need to tackle the influence of the rising power of the Ottoman Turks. In this context, this particular bull was issued by Pope Nicholas V, allowing the Portuguese to actually go to the east, to navigate to the east and fight this influence. This is happening after the fall of Constantinople. Now, subsequent to this, many explorations were carried out, and Europeans, Portuguese realized that it is not possible to circumnavigate and reach Asia easily, and therefore instead they start to explore the coast of Africa southwards, in the hope that there will be some point, a southern tip of Africa, which will allow Europeans to go around that and then maybe find some safe route to India. That was the whole idea. Now, with that conjecture, with that hope of a small possibility, Bartholomew Dias, he was able to, reach the Cape of Good Hope. The Cape of Good Hope in South Africa today. By the way, he had called it the Cape of Storms. And there were huge storms over there, and that is the nature of that particular area even today. And those storms prevented him from going ahead. He had called it Cape of Storms. It was only later that it was called as Cape of Good Hope. In 1494, a treaty was signed. After this exploration had been done, a treaty was signed, Treaty of Tordesillas, between Portuguese and the Spanish. As I mentioned, guys, earlier, the lead in this regard of exploration was being taken by the Portuguese and the Spaniards. They were the best placed to do this in that day and age. In terms of their naval advancement, they were the most suited for this purpose. But then Portuguese and Spaniards, who are neighbors and have had a bittersweet kind of a relationship, they found another issue of conflict over these explorations, and they started to fight amongst themselves. To ensure that they don't, cannibalize each other's attempts, a treaty was signed called as Treaty of Tordesillas, which basically said that East and West will go to Portuguese and the Spanish respectively. So the Western world exploration will be done by the Spaniards, whereas Portuguese will be allowed to explore the East so that they don't come into conflict with one another, and they can direct their experiments or their expeditions to further the cause that they are trying to further. Vasco da Gama in 1498 finally lands in Calicut in India. He was able to go around the Cape of Good Hope. He found a pilot, an Indian pilot. A pilot back then, of course, means a person who can guide in the journey. And that person from Gujarat, because we also had connectivity and Indian merchants used to travel. So on the eastern coast, this particular person, if I remember correctly, one Abdul Majid, he was able to escort the ship of Vasco da Gama to Calicut. Zamorin, who is the ruler of Calicut, welcomed him because, Indian civilization traditionally always welcomed people who were coming from outside. Furthermore, he was coming as a trader, so it's a business opportunity. And thirdly, it was also a great opportunity to learn more closely about Europe. Now, Kerala had colonies of Europeans at Muziris in the past also. But this was the first time that Europeans were coming by, going around the southern tip of Africa. So this was something really fantastic that had taken place. And true to his nature, the Zamorin welcomed Vasco da Gama. And Vasco da Gama, he bought a lot of stuff from Kerala and went and sold it back in markets in Europe. And in the process, Factories were established at Calicut, Cannanore, and Cochin also. For every 1 rupee that Vasco da Gama invested, he earned a profit of 60 rupees. This is just to give you a proportion. For every 1 rupee that was invested in this voyage, the profit that was earned, the return that was earned was that of 60 rupees. So you can imagine the profitability of this initiative that was taken by him. Just imagine. Calculate, by the way, the profit percentage and let me know in the chat box. Let me see how good you are with your CSAT calculations. Okay, so this is how 1498 finally the Portuguese are able to land here in India. Okay, now when they came to India, the Arabs felt threatened. The Arabs had traditionally enjoyed a complete monopoly over the trade in the Arabian Sea, and for the first time in centuries, they have a rival power, that is the Portuguese. Therefore, Portuguese factories were attacked by the Arabs. The Portuguese also retaliated and they attacked Arab ships and cargo. And in any case, you know, and back in those times, those are medieval times, guys, there was this subtext of religion-based conflict also. The Portuguese were very ardent Christians. The Pope had asked them to spread Christianity, so on and so forth. So that is also one motivation there. Arabs being Muslims, so there is that animosity at that level as well. Okay. Pedro Alvarez Cabral, 1500 to 1501, who is leading the Portuguese here in this part of Indian Ocean, he used this gunboat diplomacy. Gunboat diplomacy. When these attacks were being done on the Arabs, the Zamorin, who traditionally had very good relations with Arabs being the old trading partners, he took strong steps and measures against the Portuguese. So the Portuguese responded by attacking the coastline of Kerala at some important places. So this is often referred to as gunboat diplomacy. Of course, the term is more recent, but then the idea is the same. Gunboat diplomacy basically refers to, guys, European powers using their naval prowess to intimidate the other smaller countries. That is gunboat diplomacy. This is what the imperial European powers, may it be Britain, may it be France, all of these countries will do in due course of time, and did very much till the last century also. Okay, even when the Bangladesh war was going on, at that time US had sent its aircraft carrier towards India. So that is also referred to as gunboat diplomacy. Gunboat diplomacy. So boats who could have guns mounted on them. And this was a very strategic advantage of that day and age, guys. Getting this? Boats who had guns and they could fire it from the ship onto the coast. Now, the powers who are there over here in India or in other places in Asia, they did not have the sort of advancement of technology to respond to this kind of threat. So that is why gunboat diplomacy was often used. So conflict with Zamorin, forced to withdraw from his territories, and this led to bombardment of Kerala coast, Zamorin's coast from the sea. In 1502 and 1503, Vasco da Gama came back again, and on his second visit also there were some conflicts. He comes back again in 1503, and in this entire process he makes a lot of profit, giving the taste to the Portuguese of the kind of rewards that are there in this Oriental trade. So this is how, guys, Portuguese in the first place came to India. Now, the approach of the Portuguese starts to change when they send Francisco de Almeida to India. He will lead the Portuguese presence here in India from 1505 to 1509. He's a very famous soldier over there, a very renowned personality. He is sent sort of like governor of Portuguese presence here in Indian Ocean region. So he's the first Portuguese governor as such in India. So he is not merely being sent for an expedition. So what I'm telling you is the attitude of the Portuguese or approach of Portuguese towards this opportunity has now changed. They are not just sending expeditions to carry out simple trade or a little bit of warfare and all of that. Instead, they are wanting to have some sort of a permanent presence. So that is why he is being sent as a governor, not merely as a expedition. He destroyed Arab trade by taking over strategically located ports. Aden, Hormuz, Aden is in Yemen, Hormuz, Persian Gulf, and in Malacca, Southeast Asia. Malacca is that very narrow water body which connects the Indian Ocean region onwards to South China Sea and further onwards to the eastern routes. So it's a very narrow water body between two land masses. It's a very strategically important choke point, guys. So that was taken control of by Francisco de Almeida. I've made a video on the Malacca dilemma of China. Very briefly, I'll tell you over here. You can watch that video also. The Chinese in the early 2000s were concerned about something called as the Malacca dilemma. The Chinese economy had a vulnerability in the form of dependence on oil coming from West Asia. The Chinese felt if USA or other powers, they stop the access of this narrow Malacca Strait, then their entire economy can be brought to a grinding halt without even fighting a war. And that is why China has been so aggressive in the South China Sea and the entire region, so that this vulnerability could not be exploited, guys. Francisco de Almeida also understood the strategic importance of this choke point, and he takes control of it. He faced hostilities from navies of other rulers in this area. Egypt, being ruled by Arabs, had a formidable navy. It was under Ottoman suzerainty, but had sufficient autonomy. Gujarat also, the ruler of Gujarat, who had enjoyed the trade of Arabian Sea, was now being challenged by the Portuguese. This led to a coalition between the ruler of Egypt and Gujarat. They fighting a naval war with the Portuguese, but in the end, the Portuguese were able to destroy their navies also. The Portuguese had much more stronger, you can say, navies. Their ships were more maneuverable, and they had advancement in terms of mounted guns on the ships. So these navies could not match up to their level. Complete Portuguese domination can now be seen on the Malabar coast. Although they don't have land presence substantially as such, but then the coastline, the sea is under their domination. So the trade will come under their control. This is the initiation of blue water policy for naval superiority. Another important term, apart from gunboat diplomacy, you have to remember blue water policy. Now, what is meant by blue water policy? Blue water policy basically means a policy to pursue domination over distant waters way further from your coastline. Getting this idea? You must be able to dominate distant water bodies which are farther away from your home coastline. That is blue water policy. The navy that is built for this purpose, for blue water policy, is called as blue water navy. So you need tremendous naval capacity for it, and also you need strategic presence on distant ports. That is what Francisco de Almeida had done by getting control of Aden, Hormuz and Malacca. So he has strategic presence in the Indian Ocean region. This gives the Portuguese that blue water policy. Got the idea, guys? So please remember the terms blue water policy and blue water navy. Okay. Now, Cartas was an instrument used by the Portuguese to further this blue water policy. What is Cartas? Now let us see that. Cartas basically was a device used by the Portuguese to enforce their monopoly on certain trade items. Those items of trade which were in immense demand, which were the most popular, were monopolized by the Portuguese. And what were these items? Spices. We have understood the importance of spices for Europe already. Horses. Horses were one of the most important items of import for India. We were importing a lot of horses from the Arab world. Why were we importing these horses? Arab horses, if you see paintings of our old rulers, very often you will see that they are mounted on Arab horses. The Arab horses, guys, are extremely good war horses. The Arab horses, being desert born and bred genetically, they are prepared for long periods of endurance. And consequently, they prove to be exceptionally great horses for warfare. And then further, it has a quality of beauty, its appearance as well as its gait. All of those things add, जिसको हम कहते हैं चार चांद, to the Arab horse. So Indian rulers, they were exceptionally fond of these Arab horses for their army as well as for ceremonial purposes. So that was our item number 1. If today it is oil, back then I can say that it was Arab horses that we were importing. So Portuguese monopolized that item, that only Portuguese will sell Arab horses. An interesting story here is, guys, that when the Vijayanagar Empire was fighting the Deccani Shahis, Adil Shahi, Qutub Shahi, Nizam Shahi, so on and so forth, at that time, Vijayanagar Empire entered into an understanding with the Portuguese that they will not supply Arab horses to the Deccani Shahis, and only Vijayanagar will get exclusive supply of it. So this was to get a strategic advantage in the battles that was smartly done by Vijayanagar during Krishnadevaraya's times. So you can understand what was the importance of these horses. Such items were to be monopolized only by Portuguese. Means what? It will be only the Portuguese who will trade in these items. Other people, if you want to do some trading, then in that case, you will have to buy a permission from the Portuguese, which is called as cartas. So most valuable items, only the Portuguese will trade. For other items, you have to buy this permission, buy this permit called as cartas. So it's like a trade license which you purchased from the Portuguese and you kept it on the ship when you traded. Okay, when you are there at the high seas, the Portuguese ships will come and stop you and they will check what items you have on the ship. You're not allowed to have these monopolized items. And furthermore, do you have the cartas or no? So through this, they were able to maintain the domination over trade. Now, what if somebody did not comply with this? Then that particular ship will be attacked, it will be looted. All the people on board the ship will either be killed or they will be sold into slavery. Then the Portuguese were very, very brutal, guys. If you have the cartas, only then you are allowed to trade in other minor items. Okay, so this was a blot, the biggest blot on the history of Portuguese, that they indulged in a lot of aggression, and very often people when ladies were traveling, there were all sort of atrocities committed, and also people were sold into slavery. So this was the system of cartas, which worked exceptionally well for the Portuguese at that time. By the way, on a side note, I'm mentioning this. Another term that the Portuguese used, which remains relevant or increasingly relevant in our times also, is castas. Okay, the Portuguese understood the Indian society and used the term castas to describe the jati system. Now, castas means horizontal layering, basically. Horizontal layering. So the Portuguese could understand that the Indian society is a graded one and people are arranged based on the idea of purity. Okay, so there are layers of people in the society, and that is what they called as castas, which then became anglicized as caste. Okay, so the term caste originates from here, the Portuguese term of castas. Fine. All right. Let us now meet the next Governor General of Portuguese in India, Alfonso de Albuquerque. Okay. He definitely was very successful as the Portuguese Governor General, but he did create a lot of problems back then for Indians, and he creates some problems for aspirants in pronouncing his name. So just remember, he is Alfonso de Albuquerque. That's how we pronounce his name. He initiated the policy of dominating entire Oriental trade. Entire trade of the East should be under the domination of only one power, which is the Portuguese. Okay? Whomsoever might be the ruler on the land, that is immaterial. On the oceans, it is the Portuguese who will rule. So they are the sultans of the sea, if I may say so. policy of building strategic forts was used by them. They were not interested in, big territorial domination. It did not, serve their purpose in a great way. But instead, at strategic points, they built up forts from where their ships could be launched. And with this intent, Goa was captured in 1510 from Bijapur. It was with Bijapur, Adil Shahis of Bijapur. Now just see the rapid development. 1498, Vasco da Gama comes for the first time. He is welcomed, greeted, he's allowed to trade and go back. And in a span of 12 years, the Portuguese are able to show their claws and snatch away the territory of Goa from Bijapur. Sultan of Bijapur was in conflict with the Vijayanagar Empire, and taking advantage of this, with the help of Vijayanagar, Bijapur was taken over by the Portuguese. Why was Goa so crucial? Number one, natural harbors present over there. So that gave a big advantage to the Portuguese. It is very strategically located. How is it strategically located? Portuguese wanted to dominate the trade of India. And by being present in Goa, they could control the trade of Malabar and also the trade of Gujarat. So it is midway, it is in between. By being present over there in Goa, they can dominate these two wings of the trade. It also gave them a small territorial base. Goa is the only place where they had some territory. In other places, they remained confined to coastal areas only. They seized and established strongholds in Malabar as well as in Ormuz. Okay, some places, as he has the policy of building strategic forts, these were taken over in Malabar and in Ormuz in Persian Gulf. Okay, I hope you are able to relate with this policy that Alfonso de Albuquerque is implementing. This ensured Portuguese strategic control over the trade of entire Indian Ocean region. Okay. Now the Portuguese are in complete control of the Indian Ocean region's trade. A land power, howsoever strong it might be on the land, it was helpless in terms of its trade on the sea because of the Portuguese. Alfonso de Albuquerque also took up some social measures which we must know. He abolished sati in the dominion of the Portuguese wherever they had control. He encouraged Portuguese to take up local wives also. Now they wanted to get embedded into the society. They wanted to have fixed roots over here. They needed manpower. Portuguese had limited manpower, but by marrying with local women, they could over the decades, get a lot of manpower. That was the idea. Conversions were encouraged during this period. The Europeans, some historians use this shorthand. The Europeans had three primary motivations when they initially ventured out to find these, colonial possessions or areas. What were these three G's? Number one is gold. Number two is glory. And number three is God. Gold, glory, and God. These were the motivations of Europeans. Now, for the Portuguese, God was especially very important. They were very devout Christians. They had taken it as a mission to spread Christianity in the areas of their control. And therefore, we see instances of forced conversions also taking place. He introduced new plans and also built up several infrastructure projects in the areas that Portuguese occupied then. Subsequent governors after Alfonso de Albuquerque, unlike Alfonso, they were not that much keen about social or other initiatives. Their focus was more only on commerce to make money. Alfonso de Albuquerque, on the other hand, is very significant for various other measures also that he took. All right. So we have seen Almeida and we have seen Albuquerque. After this, we need to know one more Portuguese Governor General, Nino da Cunha, from 1529 to 1538. He shifts the administrative headquarters to Goa. Goa was already in their possession, but the headquarters is shifted to Goa. He secured basin from Gujarat. Okay. Where is this basin? You can see over here. It is north of Mumbai. So this area, this coastal area was under the Sultan of Gujarat, and the Sultan of Gujarat was in a fight with the Mughals. This is the period where, Humayun is the Mughal ruler, and he is in conflict with Bahadur Shah, the Sultan of Gujarat, and in that conflict, Nino da Cunha was able to secure Basil. Later, he deceived and killed the same ruler, Bahadur Shah. He became an ally of the Portuguese, but then he was deceived and killed by him at the sea. Settlements were also created in Bengal with headquarters at Hooghly. The eastern coast is also very important, and therefore at Hooghly also, one more possession was created by the Portuguese, although they will not hold on to it for long. So this is what Estado da India, okay, the state of Portuguese in India, looked like at its peak with their small presence everywhere in the form of factories. Now, please note, guys, here the term factory should not be confused with modern day factories. These are not factories of industrial revolution. Here, the term factory basically means a place where goods were stored for the purpose of trade. European powers, when they came here in India, initially for trading purpose alone, they needed secured places where their goods, their wares could be kept, and that is what is meant by factory. The term has a different connotation in industrial revolution later. All right. Now, religion related policies. As I mentioned to you, gold, glory, and God. This was the motivation of Europeans, and for Portuguese, God was particularly important, and therefore we see the aim of spreading Christianity. There was a clear hostile attitude towards Muslims in general and Arabs in particular. Why is that so? I told you, because of the larger context of that day and age, where Christian Europe and the Muslim world had seen a series of conflicts. And it was the Pope who had motivated the Portuguese to actually go and carry out explorations and try to curtail the control of the Muslims. Remember, the Muslims are rising under the Ottomans. They have taken the capital of Eastern Roman Empire, and they are now at the gates of Eastern Europe. So that is why it was very significant. Furthermore, the influence of Muslims was also spreading on the eastern coast of Africa. So all of this back then had worried the Christian world. Now, when we discuss all of these things, guys, please understand that we discuss these things as students of history. Okay, it is foolish to actually import those rivalries in today's times. We only try to dispassionately and objectively try to understand what has happened in the past, what mistakes we as human beings have made in the past, and try to prevent them later. This should be our attitude as students of history. So the approach was hostile towards Muslims and Arabs, but also intolerance could be seen against Hindus as well. We also see some evidences or several evidences of post-conversion too. Okay, and one blot that was there on the Portuguese was slave trade. I've told you about transatlantic slave trade in one of my previous lectures. I have a detailed video on this concept of transatlantic slave trade, where European traders, they practiced this transatlantic slave trade, and when they came in the Indian Ocean region also, the practice of slavery was there. Now, not that slavery was not there in India as such, but then this is one thing that we must know about the Portuguese as well. Conditions favoring the rise of Portuguese rule in India, or Portuguese, you can say, influence in India. Why is it that the Portuguese were able to have such decisive control in the peninsular India, especially its trade in this particular period? The reason was political fragmentation in northern India and Deccan. We see that this period when the Portuguese are rising, at that time there is no strong single empire as such. The Indian polity had fractured. We see that Mughals were just trying to find their feet. There were rival powers in Gujarat, in Bengal, so on and so forth. In peninsular India, the Bahmani Sultanate had long ago disintegrated, and there were multiple smaller powers. Vijayanagar and Bahmanis could not get along, and the advantage was taken by this foreign power as such. The same history always repeating itself. Abraham Lincoln had famously said, "A house divided against itself, a house divided against itself cannot stand." Very much proven through many episodes in our history. Lack of naval strength of Indian powers. Lack of naval strength. Now, apart from the imperial Cholas, we don't have really Indian powers who successfully, built up strong naval strength. Yes, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj also had a navy, but then, he is like the first person who is starting out on something like that. So he had very less time to build a very formidable navy. He had also, understood the problems that Portuguese and such other foreign players can pose, and he always tried to check them in. Apart from that, we noted in our last class that Tipu Sultan also built a board of admiralty, and he was also trying to build up naval prowess. But then all of that was during his period, so it takes time, guys. Building up of a navy, it requires multiple generations effort. So that never happened, unfortunately, during this phase, and consequently, Indian powers did not have the naval might to take on the Portuguese. Next, Chinese imperial decree limiting navigation. This is a very interesting thing, guys. Chinese naval decree limiting navigation. Now, into the 15th century, until the 15th century, the Chinese had a very strong navy. Their very famous admiral Zheng He had done several bold expeditions and reached up to coast of Africa also. The entire Indian Ocean region was being explored by the Chinese navy. But in the 15th century, very unwisely, the Chinese rulers felt that, see, we are incurring more expense than we are getting income on this. We are incurring more expense than we are getting income in the process. And therefore, through a decree, they decided to abandon. Can you imagine that? They decided to abandon their entire naval strength. And that created the space for Europeans to come and dominate over here. The Chinese Navy was so strong, guys, that they had more ships at that point of time in the 15th century than all of the major European powers put together. Had the Chinese not done this, suicide, if I may use that word, naval suicide, then perhaps history would have been very different. Europeans would not have been so easily able to take over control of Asia in different areas. So that is one major reason. Decline of Arab merchants in the trade. The Arabs who had traditionally dominated the trade, they were very easily sidestepped by the Portuguese. They did not have the kind of fighting strength that the Portuguese had. See, Europeans, guys, they were constantly fighting, and they were fighting not just on the land, they were fighting on the seas also. And when you do something constantly, then there is something called as leveling up. With every next conflict, you learn something new from the last one and you implement in the next one. Consequently, when you advance in this manner, what happens is that you are much more skilled than what you were earlier. So the Europeans were a lot more advanced in fighting at the high seas than what Arabs were. The Arabs were simply traders. They were not used to fighting as such. And consequently, they were not able to take on the Portuguese challenge. And very important point, the use of cannon guns by the Portuguese on ships. The ships were more maneuverable. See, when a ship is a long vessel, the cannon guns are placed on the sides. If you've seen Pirates of Caribbean and such other movies, you would remember that the cannon guns are on the side. So when a ship wants to fire at a target in the front, it has to first turn around like this at 90 degrees, and then the cannon guns can open. So the ships require more maneuverability. Number one, they have to move fast. And secondly, they must be robust enough to hold the recoil of these big cannon guns. Okay, the guns have big recoil. They can come back, several feet, 10, 12 feet also. So the ships must be robust enough to remain stable, because not one, but multiple guns will be firing at multiple decks. Okay, you can imagine that. So what kind of impact in one direction the ship can tilt? So that requires, certain level of engineering in shipbuilding. So that the Portuguese had been able to develop, which the Indian powers had not as yet done. Now, reasons for decline of Portuguese. Religious policies. Why did the Portuguese not come to dominate India like the British did? The British were also a Western power. They came much later than the Portuguese did. Portuguese were pioneers in that sense. So why could the Portuguese not achieve, if I may, pose the question like this, what the English could? Reason number one, religious policy. intolerance towards other religions, followers of other religions, Hindus and Muslims. Now, if you see the English, they had a lot of racial arrogance, but then to their credit, they, to a great extent, in comparison and in context of their day and age, we have to see this. If you see in that context, then the English were much more tolerant. Till 1813, Charter Act of 1813, they did not allow missionaries to go about, preaching. Charter of the Act of 1813 for the first time allows it. When the revolt of 1857 took place, the British realized that the Indians are very finicky about their religion. They'll take anything else, but they'll not take, issues with their religion lightly. Therefore, after that, the English, gave up all their social reform measures. Gone were the days when sati was banned and widow remarriage was, allowed. After 1857, they don't take any strong social measures. Why? Lest the Indians are offended in terms of their religious beliefs. But the Portuguese, on the other hand, their religious policy was very, very intolerant. Second, dishonest trade practices. The Portuguese raided ships. Okay, they engaged in piracy, attacking, taking over other people's ships, their wares, selling people into slavery. All of this led to hostility of local rulers. Okay, they were not, looking at this as a long-term gain. To have a long-term venture, you have to develop a positive goodwill. They, in fact, did exactly the opposite. They developed an ill will amongst Indians for them. Discovery of Brazil. When Brazil was discovered, the Portuguese, who were, in that constant conflict with the Spaniards and always wanted to be one up over them, they focused all their attention on Brazil. See, other part of the Latin American world, Spanish is spoken. But in Brazil, the Portuguese language is spoken because it was the Portuguese who colonized that. So focus shifted away from India for the Portuguese. Trade monopoly was ended. For almost a century or more, in fact, the Portuguese were able to dominate the trade in Indian Ocean region. But with arrival of the Dutch first and then the British, this Portuguese monopoly of trade was broken, and now they did not have the kind of economic resources that they had during the 16th century. In the 17th century, we will see that the Portuguese power is going to slowly decline because they don't have monopoly anymore. Decline of Goa. Goa suffered a decline in its importance with other ports coming up, with other European powers developing their factories in other coastal areas. The kind of importance that Goa had earlier during Portuguese times, that will also suffer. Then rivalries with European powers. Not only did the Dutch and English come here and rival them in terms of trade, but they were each trying to oust each other. During this age of mercantilism in Europe, the focus always was on having exclusive monopolies. Portuguese were enjoying this monopoly in Indian Ocean trade. When the Dutch and British come in, they come with the intention of supplanting, not supplementing. They did not want to have their share of trade, but they wanted to have the full share of trade. And this led to a lot of rivalries and conflicts between the Portuguese and other European competitors. And this, now they could, subdue the Indians because of their advanced ships. But then with Dutch and English, they were at the same level of the game. So they could not subdue them easily. In fact, they were slightly more advanced than the Portuguese. And consequently, we see that all of this rivalry, all of these fights with local powers and the rival European competitors, they reduce the influence of Portuguese. I hope you got this, guys. Then other European powers started challenging. This is the corollary of the same point, guys. So for these reasons, Portuguese suffered a decline during this period. Now, in the decline phase, let us note some major events that are relevant from our history perspective. 1595, the Dutch defied Portuguese and navigated around Cape of Good Hope. If you see in South Africa, even to this date, there is a substantial population of people of Dutch origin. If you see their teams, you will see names which are very typically English. Jonty Rhodes, Justin Kemp. These are English sounding names. And then you have Faf du Plessis. Okay, these type of names also. So Fanny de Villiers. So what are these names? These names indicate at people of Dutch origin. So the Dutch came to this area, they reduced the Portuguese influence and went on to establish themselves in the southern part of Africa. Later, the British will come and push the Dutch people back. But then as early as 1595, this great advantage that the Portuguese had over the control of Cape of Good Hope, that was taken away. 1603, the Dutch blockaded Goa. The Dutch blockaded Goa. That prized possession that the Portuguese had, their headquarters, was blockaded. English defeated the Portuguese navy off Bombay in 1611. You know, when the English came to India, when their first ambassador came in 1609 at the court of Jahangir, Jahangir was not ready to, indulge the English because of Portuguese influence. The Mughals also feared that, see, if we entertain the English and give them permission for building their factories, then the Portuguese at the sea will harm our trade. That was the kind of dread even the mighty Mughals had, because they did not have any control on the seas. So the English had to prove to the Mughals that, see, we are as strong, if not more, than the Portuguese at the sea. Okay, you have to do some chamatkar so that people will do you namaskar. And that is what the British did basically over here in 1611. They defeated the Portuguese navy off the coast of Bombay, and that is when Mughals will be impressed, and in 1615 they will allow the English to set up factories in different parts of India. 1631, Hooghly was lost to the Mughal Empire. In eastern areas, you remember, in Bengal they had this possession in Hooghly that was taken over by the Mughals. Okay. In 1661, by the time you reach the second half of the 17th century, the Portuguese have realized that their heyday is now gone. They cannot take on two European rivals at the same time, English and Dutch. So they decide that we have to come to terms with one power, either the Dutch or the English. The English were more suitable for them, and therefore they patched up with English. And in 1661, marital alliance between Prince Charles of England and Princess Catherine Braganza, Portuguese, was cemented. And in that marriage, Bombay, which was under Portuguese possession, was given as gift to the British royals. That is how Bombay was transferred to whom? That was transferred to English. Bombay, by the way, then had 7 islands. 7 islands, and Bombay Main was one of them. So that's why it was named as Bombay, but there were others also. The Britishers, did land reclamation and created the island city of Bombay. That will happen later. Anyways, this is 1661. In 1739, under Bajirao Peshwa, we have seen this discussion earlier, Marathas captured Salsette and Bassin, which are north of Bombay city from the Portuguese. And after this, the Portuguese will not have any significant role to play except in their possessions in Goa and Daman Diu and some small other places. Now, what was the contribution of Portuguese to Indian history? Portuguese started the European era in India, the first penetration by Europeans, and consequently they became our doorway to the advancements of the European world. Emergence of naval power. Portuguese ships had cannons, multi-decked structures. They had multiple stories, floors inside a ship, multi-decked structures and innovative defense features. All of these ideas were new to Indians, and Indians were able to realize and understand their importance, and also after few decades start to emulate that, build that. Military innovations. The Portuguese brought body armor like what Indians had not seen before. Their body armors were much more strong. Matchlock men. Matchlocks were specific types of guns. Earlier in India, we had flintlock guns, but they brought matchlock guns. Drilling techniques. Okay, how a soldier should be drilled, the march past, commands, the discipline of troops, all of that was developing in the European world, that was brought to India by the Portuguese. Culturally, missionaries, came to India, and they, of course, they practiced or they tried to spread Christianity, but also many other good things as well. So education and other things were also brought by them. Church supported and patronized arts like painting, carving, and sculpture in India. So these arts which were practiced in Europe, we of course had our own schools. We had our own schools of paintings. But then European ideas of paintings, they were brought here to India by the Portuguese. Akbar invited, a delegation of the Portuguese to come to the royal court and discuss with him different ideas, their religious ideas, their advancements in the West, so on and so forth. He in fact appointed a Portuguese Jesuit priest as the tutor of his son Daniel. So this is something really fascinating and amazing about Akbar. He is indulging into discussion on religion, metaphysics, and philosophy with Jesuit priests, Portuguese Jesuit priests. Okay, this shows the liberal, tolerant kind of tendencies that Akbar had, and his genuine curiosity to understand the different advancements in different parts of the world. His appointing of a priest as his son's tutor also goes to show the same thing. So cultural influence was very strong. Metallurgy. Goa became center for intricate silver and gold filigree work, foliage work, jewelry embedding, so on and so forth. So many different types of crafts were also brought by them. New crops were also brought. Potato, for example. Potato is a crop from the New World that was introduced here in India by the Portuguese. If you go to the western coast in India, where the Portuguese influence was there, even today, potato is called as batata. Batata. In Mumbai, if you go, you ask for vada, it is called as batata vada. The origin is in the Portuguese name of it, which is patata. Patata. That's the Portuguese word. From that has come the Marathi word batata, still used to this date. And the English word potato is also coming from that. Tobacco, which was cultivated in Americas, that was too brought to India by the Portuguese. Shipbuilding and printing technology. Ships, of course, I've told you their importance. The ships of the Portuguese were much more advanced. Printing technology. Gutenberg had developed the printing press. The printing press was then extensively used to print Bibles and spread them across the world. That printing technology was also brought to India by the Portuguese. Okay. Now, after this, we have to see other European trading powers. We've already seen the Portuguese. Now, after this, we are going to see the Dutch, English, French, and Danes, but not in this lecture. For today, this session concludes over here with our discussion on Portuguese. In our next session, we are going to see the role that Dutch, English, and French played in India. Do keep connected with this series, guys. You can download the notes from my Telegram channel. If you've watched this lecture thus far, I'm sure you found a lot of value in it. Don't forget to like this video and also share it with your friends. I'll see you in my next class. Thank you very much.